and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report by number.
Senator from Kansas, Mr. Moran, proposes an amendment numbered 1154 to amendment numbered 891.
I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, for 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Is there objection? Seeing none, no objection. Go ahead.
Mr. President, thank you. Amendment 1154 is on community care funding within the Department of Veterans Affairs. The VA has estimated that it needs $13.4 billion for medical care. This bill provides $14.4 billion in care, but it currently limits that how much money can be spent within that care for community care. So we generally have all the care is within the VA, but sometimes people are referred out to the community. Sometimes there's telehealth, and sometimes the care actually occurs in a VA facility. This would eliminate that cap of $4.4 billion and replace it with spending $5 billion on community care, the amount that is expected the VA will need. Mr. President, again, this amendment removes this arbitrary funding barrier, and it also includes additional dollars for maintenance at our VA medical centers. I retain the balance of my time.
Mr. President.
The senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I rise and unfortunately have to speak against this amendment of my good friend Jerry Moran. But here's the deal. If you talk to the veterans, they like VA care. But there are some cases where community care is very, very important for them to have. Either their personal reasons or maybe it's because it's closer to where they live. So community care is also very, very important. Here's the problem I have with Ranking Member Moran's amendment. This bill sets it as a cap of $4 billion, okay? They go over that, they have to come to us and ask for permission to go over that. Under this amendment, they can spend any amount on care, up to $5 billion and even more if they so choose, without our permission. I want Jerry Moran and myself and others to be able to say, hey, what do you spend that money for? Is it really being spent to the best advantage? And by the way, that's not only for community care, that's for VA care too. So I would like to leave that as a cap instead of a floor. That's why I oppose this amendment.
Mr. President, the Mission Act allows for the veteran and the VA to make the decision where the care should occur. I ask for the yeas
question
and nays.
is on the amendment.
And I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe.
I know. Do you anticipate having a vote on the Sullivan amendment and a vote on the bill?
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane.
Have the roll call on the bill as amended.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders.
Depends on where it would be and how it would lie.
Mr. Sass.
Yeah. Really? If it's going to be agreed to and put on
Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina.
Hey, Trish?
Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, no. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye.
Is there anyone else wishing to vote? Change their vote? Seeing none, the yeas are 49. The nays are 50. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 12.
Just a moment. Chamber will be in order.
I call up amendment number 1233 and ask it be reported by number.
The clerk will report by number.
The senator from Alaska, Ms. Murkowski, for herself, and Mr. Portman proposes an amendment number 1233 to amendment number 891.
I ask unanimous consent for 2 minutes of debate, equally divided.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is the amendment we're waiting for. This is a bipartisan amendment. This is so bipartisan that we've already agreed to a voice vote. So listen carefully. Yes, thank you for that. Pre-pandemic, our public schools have identified about 1.5 million kids who experience homelessness. That's 2.7% of all public school students. So think about what that means. That was pre-pandemic. We know that that number is higher now. So our amendment's pretty simple here. We reallocate less than 1% of the funding for the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund to ensure that homeless youth and kids have the resources that they need to get into and succeed in school. In Alaska and around the country, the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic downturn has increased the strain on our families and the need for services. Too many of the kids have left their homes, been pushed out of their homes, sometimes many of them to escape a dangerous situation. They're dealing with the challenges of virtual learning. These kids are worrying about where to sleep at night, how they're going to eat dinner, if they're going to be safe. This amendment ensures that these kids, no matter the trauma and the challenges that they face outside of the classroom, will have a safe place to sleep and access to the wraparound services that they need. We have a responsibility to ensure that this vulnerable population, many of whom will be subject to predation, violence, or trafficking, is not forgotten or left behind. I would like to yield to my friend and my colleague, Senator Manchin.
The senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, I also proudly rise with my colleague on this piece of legislation. There's not one of us in this room that doesn't have rising homelessness for our children in your state. Not one of us. We're all experiencing that right now. Over 10,000 in the state of West Virginia alone. And these are children, basically, if you look at it, it's estimated that 1 in 4 homeless children, that's about 420,000 kids, are potentially unidentified and are not even connected with a school system. Not even connected. They're couch surfing. It's just horrible, horrible, horrible what's going on. And I'm so proud this is such a bipartisan piece of legislation. And less than 1%, $800 million is all we've asked for to use in this, and everyone has supported it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All time has expired. The question is on the amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Okay. Mr. President?
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, I have a motion to commit at the desk, and I ask that it be reported.
The clerk will report the motion.
The senator from Montana, Mr. Daines, moves to commit the bill, H.R. 1319, to the Committee on Foreign Relations with instructions.
Mr. President, this motion to commit will send this bill back to the Foreign Relations Committee to include an authorization of the Keystone XL pipeline in the final bill. In fact, as we saw earlier this morning, the Keystone XL pipeline has bipartisan support. Here's the difference. This morning's amendment vote was a 60-vote threshold. This is a simple majority. This is good for union jobs. It's great for our rural communities, reduces emissions. It's time to get this done. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this motion.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, colleagues, this amendment is meant for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to kill the American Rescue Plan, to kill all the work that has brought us to this moment, to kill the $1,400 checks to American families that will help them stay in their homes and put food on the table, to kill the extended unemployment checks that millions are depending upon us not to let lapse next week, to kill the ability to put more vaccine in the arms of our families, to kill the desperate aid that small businesses need to stay alive, to kill the chance to lift 50% of all of those children in poverty into the sunlit plains of opportunity. The Senate has already expressed itself today on Keystone. The committee rules could not accommodate this referral in the time frame offered. Enough is enough. It's time to defeat this amendment and pass the American Rescue Plan. I urge my colleagues to vote against it.
Senator from Montana.
The only thing that's been killed is the Keystone XL pipeline by President Biden. This resurrects the Keystone XL pipeline. The union jobs are needed. The rural communities need these tax revenues for their schools. This is what we want to do. We had bipartisan support for that this morning. Let's do it again. I urge passage of this motion to commit.
Question is on the motion. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mrs. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, no. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. I didn't hear you. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Durbin, no.
It's the last minute.
Have you been told we actually want roll call? Have you been told we actually want roll call?
I think Schumer's out here now, but you know, whatever.
Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye.
The fly is in the, was in there. The fly is in the.
It's the yeas, you'll say the yeas are 49, the nays are 15.
Got it. Yes. Are there any other senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change his or her vote? Seeing none, the yeas are 49, the nays are 50. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I call up Amendment 1391 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report by number.
The senator from Virginia, Mr. Warner, for himself and Mr. Rubio, proposes an amendment number 1391 to amendment number 891.
I ask unanimous consent that there be 2 minutes equally divided.
Is there objection? None? Go ahead.
My colleagues, I believe this may be the last amendment, and it is broadly bipartisan. This amendment simply continues provisions that were included in the earlier COVID relief packages. It was called Section 3610, and it ensures that our classified government contractor workforce, a workforce that oftentimes takes many years to receive top-level security clearance, continue to get compensated through the balance of the fiscal year. Failure to do this would lose this workforce to private sector and other competitors and seriously put our national security at risk. I would point out that an independent bill of this nature cleared unanimously earlier this week on this side of the aisle, and I yield the balance of my time to Senator Rubio.
Senator from Kentucky.
I yield to Senator Rubio.
Senator from Florida.
Thank you. And this is important to the intelligence community. I just ask that no one be a fly in the ointment here.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kentucky.
This amendment is an insult to every cashier at Walmart or bagger at Kroger who comes to work every day in person. This amendment is an insult to every meat packer or waiter or waitress who comes to work every day in person. Supporters of this amendment care more about government contractors making $100,000 a year than they do about the people who serve your food. If food servers and grocery store clerks can come to work in person, I think government contractors can too. I urge a no vote.
Mr. President, I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst, Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham, Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Grassley, Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Haggerty, Mr. Haggerty, aye. Ms. Hassan, Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Rono, Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. King, Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan, Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis, Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray, Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla, Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul, Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch, Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Romney, Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen, Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass, Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer, Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow, Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune, Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock, Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren, Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye.
Looks like Portman's getting ready to do.
This motion, the yeas are 93. The nays are 6. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to Rule 4, Paragraph 2, the hour of noon having arrived, the Senate having been in continuous session since yesterday, the Senate will suspend for a prayer from the Senate chaplain. Dr. Black.
Let us pray. Eternal God, who guides us through life's marathons, we praise your powerful name. Have compassion on us and answer our prayers. Lord, you control our destiny. You have promised to do for us all that you have planned. May our lawmakers confidently face the future, believing that their times are in your hand. Guided by your loving providence, may our senators refuse to depart from the path on which you have placed them. Grant that your blessings will rest on your people now and always. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Call up the amendment, ask for the 2 minutes.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader and the Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I'm pleased that we have finally come to this point. This amendment makes a series of conforming and technical changes. It strikes provisions that the parliamentarian advised were extraneous. It makes a series of perfecting changes on behalf of reconciled committees while preserving the will that the Senate has worked over this long day. I call up my amendment 1398 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
The senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment number 1398 to amendment number 891.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. President.
Thanks, Ben.
This amendment,
Senator from Ohio.
This amendment comes after about 24 hours of discussion here as a surprise, so we're just looking at it for the first time. But there are 2 things that are very disturbing about it. One is it completely distorts workers' compensation for federal employees, which is substantially increased cost to taxpayers, of course. It also sets a terrible precedent in terms of how workers' comp works. Workers' comp, of course, is for people who are injured on the job, and you have to show you've been injured on the job. That's how it works. It's a basic principle of workers' comp. In this case, this amendment changes the rules to require compensation for COVID-19 lost wages, no matter how risky a federal employee's behavior might have been outside of the workplace. In other words, no questions asked. If you're a federal worker, you get COVID-19, you get this. That's not the way workers' comp works. So this is a big change in federal workforce policy, and it establishes, again, a dangerous new precedent in workers' comp policy generally. It also creates the wrong incentives. Think about it. For the employee and for the employer. So we oppose this. For federal workers, the statute is very explicit. It says federal workers' comp is paid for disability or death resulting from personal injury sustained while in the performance of duty. Second, I ask for an additional 30 seconds.
Without objection.
We're just finding out there's another $10 billion added through this amendment to state and local government. I don't know if everybody was listening when Senator Romney gave his explanation during his amendment of what's happening with regard to our states, but a lot of our states don't need the money. Some do, some don't. And there's no requirements here that if you've got a surplus or if you otherwise don't have COVID-19 expenses that you don't get the money. And yet we're adding another $10 billion to that pot through this one amendment. So, of course, we object to this amendment. There may be other stuff in there, too. I hope everybody has a chance to look at it because we have not had a chance to do so yet. But I hope we do not create the wrong incentives. Hope we do not create this situation where we are substantially increasing costs to the taxpayer through changes in workers' comp and adding another $10 billion to a category where it's been shown, in many cases, not to be needed.
Senator's time has expired.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the technical amendment and very strong support of the overall bill, the American Rescue Plan. Let's be clear. This bill that we are completing now is the most significant piece of legislation to benefit working people in the modern history of this country. And not only are we going to go forward to crush this pandemic, to rebuild our economy and to get our kids back to school safely, we're going to do something even more important. We're going to help restore faith in the United States government among the people of our country. The people are hurting, and today we respond.
The all time has expired. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Oppose? No. The ayes appear to have it, and the ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Question is on amendment number 891 as amended.
The question is on amendment 891 as amended. All in favor say aye. Oppose? No. The ayes appear to have it, and the ayes do have it.
The amendment as amended is agreed to.
The amendment as amended is agreed to.
Question is on the clerk will read.
Clerk will read the bill for the third time.
Calendar number 10, H.R. 1319, an act to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Title II of S-Con Res 5.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, may we have order, please?
Senate will be in order. Those who have conversations, please take them off the floor or to the cloakrooms.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's been a long day, a long night, a long year, but a new day has come. And we tell the American people, help is on the way. When Democrats assumed the majority in this chamber, we promised to pass legislation to rescue our people from the depths of the pandemic and bring our economy and our country roaring back. In a few moments, we are going to deliver on that promise. This bill will deliver more help to more people than anything the federal government has done in decades. It is broader, deeper, and more comprehensive in helping working families and lifting people out of poverty than anything Congress has seen or accomplished in a very long time. The pandemic has affected nearly every aspect of American life, so this bill spans the gamut and provides support to every part of our country. For Americans who doubted that the government can help them in this time of crisis, you'll be getting direct checks. Your schools will receive assistance to reopen quickly and safely. Your local businesses will get another lifeline. And the day when you receive the vaccine will be a lot sooner. The American Rescue Plan will go down as one of the most sweeping federal recovery efforts in history. It's never easy to pass legislation as momentum as this, but it will all and soon be worth it. Now, I know that on Saturday morning, the American people aren't watching our proceedings here. They're probably out walking the dog or sitting down with at breakfast with the kids. But I want them to know help is on the way. that their government is going to give one final push to get us over the finish line. I want the American people to know that we're going to get through this, and someday soon, our businesses will reopen, our economy will reopen, and life will reopen. We will end this terrible plague, and we will travel again and send our kids to school again and be together again. Our job right now is to help our country get from this stormy present to that hopeful future. And it starts with voting aye on the legislation before us. Vote yes on the American Rescue Plan. Vote yes. And before I yield the floor, one final note. Let us all express our deepest gratitude to all of my colleagues. We went through a long, long period in the last day. To the staffs of the committees and the personal Senate offices who worked so hard to put this legislation together. And especially, let us thank the great floor staff, the clerks, the cafeteria workers, the custodial staff, and the Capitol Police. Many of them have worked for as many as 36 hours straight. My notes here say, let's give them a round of applause, but you've already done that. And of course, one more thank you to my great and wonderful staff. I'll thank all of them by name at a later date, because I want them to be awake and alert when I do. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
The Senate has never spent $2 trillion in a more haphazard way or through a less rigorous process. Voters gave Senate Democrats the slimmest possible majority. Voters picked a president who promised unity and bipartisanship. Democrats' response is to ram through what they call, quote, the most progressive domestic legislation in a generation on a razor-thin majority in both houses. The right path was obvious. We followed it 5 times last year. 5 rescue packages totaling $4 trillion, and none of them got fewer than 90 votes. The Senate wrote the CARES Act, Republicans and Democrats shoulder to shoulder. That was the road to real pandemic relief, but Democrats actually wanted, Mr. President, something else. They explained their intent very clearly, to exploit this crisis, quote, as a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision. That's how you get this massive bill with only 1% for vaccinations. That ignores the science on reopening schools that's stuffed with non-COVID related spending that even top liberal economists say is wrong for the recovery. Democrats inherited a tide that is already turning. 2021 is already set to be our comeback year because the American people's resilience and the bipartisan foundation that we laid last year. We could have worked together to speed up victory, but our Democratic colleagues made a decision. Their top priority wasn't pandemic relief, it was their Washington wish list. So, Mr. President and colleagues, I strongly recommend a no vote.
The clerk will call. The question then is on passage of the bill as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso.
Elizabeth.
Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
No senator wishes to change their vote. If not, The yeas are 50. The nays are 49. The bill as amended is passed.
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 12.
Questions on the motion?
Questions on the motion?
All in favor say aye.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Those opposed, no.
The ayes appear to have it.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I ask unanimous I note the absence of a quorum.
Call the roll.
Call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Now I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection,
Clerk will report the nomination.
the clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Louise Fudge of Ohio to be Secretary.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 12, Marcia Louise Fudge of Ohio, to be Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, signed by 16 senators as follows.
I ask consent the